Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series. We take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the adventure Target Run, designed by Geoffrey Golden for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy the content, consider using my affiliate links for online shopping, supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Target Run is a sports comedy adventure, which I think is a really cool idea. I would love to have more like classic movie genres. Even take the actual movies themselves and just turn them into D&D adventures, because then people kind of recognize a lot of the tropes and the characters and the events that are going to happen, and yet you apply that to the usual shenanigans of a D&D party, and obviously with just the fantastical world of the Forgotten Realms, that is, I think, a recipe for success. So I would love to see more ideas like this that take kind of a well-known genre that has been harvested many, many times in film and books and things, but not maybe quite used as much in a D&D adventure. So it's really neat to see. This particular one is for tier 1, which I am kind of annoyed that the designer doesn't actually specify, because those of us who've played any amount of D&D know that there's a big difference between a level 1 party and a level 3 party, for example. Now, that being said, this does not involve a lot of combat. It is mostly social situations with a lot of like skill checks and stuff, because it is supposed to be about this big sporting match. And sports comedy, in case I need to remind everybody, think like Adam Sandler movies I grew up with, so like Happy Gilmore or The Waterboy. I think from the 2000s era would have been like Dodgeball. I can't remember too many from like the 90s specifically. That Will Ferrell did a couple of sports comedy movies, Talladega Nights, I guess, for NASCAR. Different than the sports drama, which is more of a serious, like, Remember the Titans or something, where it's kind of, I mean, there's, there'll be drama in the comedy and there'll be comedy in the drama, but like mostly it's about like telling a serious story with, and typically the drama is more based on real world events, for example, whereas the comedy is just kind of being kind of funny. And this one, I think, the humor has to a lot of time. It's tough to write comedy, I think, honestly, and any actual writer will tell you that. It's if you want to start off writing anything, go for horror first. It's easier to scare people than to make them laugh. Talk about an interesting insight of the human condition. But I think a lot of the comedy is going to come from the players interacting with just a wide variety of personalities and events, and for that reason, I do think the designer does a good job of throwing different things at the players to deal with. It's all wrapped around this title, or not title character, but this lead character, Tasvin, who is a dwarf whose big dream is competing in a sports called Allegan, which is apparently mostly done by high elves, and it's kind of I don't know, like a polo or something, where it's like it just tends to be played by like upper class, or what's the like, is it rowing that I'm thinking of also, that like is like Ivy League school shit? um, to where it's kind of she's kind of stepping up beyond her means, I guess, to try to compete. It literally, there's this stadium, not even a stadium, kind of just a little arena at this resort that she's going to, and the party is either on their way to the resort specifically to just kind of chill between missions, which seems like an odd thing for a party to do anyway, because you're pretty much doing missions all the time, or you've got you've already basically met this person and now you're going to go there. So this is basically her story, and she accompanies the players throughout it, and which I think is fine. That's your hook for getting involved. It's her dream. She offers to pay people, or if you can just help her out, then she wants to compete in this Allegan sporting match. There's this neat little sidebar backdrop where the elves, what they use as an arena was the former home of a bunch of pixies. So there's a cool subplot where there's a bunch of really pissed off pixies that are trying to get their home back and kind of engaging in acts of like, I don't know, playful pranks and stuff during matches to try and get their home back. And it's kind of played for laughs, but also there's a bit of seriousness to it, where the players can choose to really side with the pixies at the end, or even help like squash them or get rid of them or something. I just appreciated there was another subplot going on. The designer does give us some helpful flow charts here that kind of determines, the events the party can run into in the various chapters. The maps, on the one hand, we do get maps, which is cool. On the other hand, they are Dice and Logos maps, which I'm never a fan of and don't ever look that good in a virtual tabletop. So that's a bummer. And it's a difficult thing because on the one hand, anytime you include maps, I'll usually put it as a pro. But if it's an art style that I don't think is going to work for a VTT, I'll put that as a con. I feel kind of mixed now. I feel like maybe I shouldn't do either one and just say it's got maps and not include that as a pro or a con because, hey, it's good we got maps, but it's a bummer that it's this art style that is not really compatible with the VTT very well. There is some errors I noticed in the actual map here where it talks about the fact that you meet Tasman kind of down here at number 2, I believe. You can find an old trophy at 1, which is you're going through this forest towards this resort. It says that you can make a beeline by going 1, 2, 3, 4, which is there's a hawk encounter, which could be most likely your only combat encounter, a bunch of enchanted hawks that kind of guard the area. Or you could be led astray and go towards the Pixie Ruins. And I like that the Pixie Ruins, they don't actually interrupt the flow of the story. You only meet like one of the leader pixies who is like missing her pixie dust. And it's just kind of interesting for a chance encounter, and then she kind of goes away anyway. So it's not like a big fight or you meet with them and it really changes the whole dynamic of the story. Instead, they're already like geared up for what they're going to do. It's just a chance for you to kind of see and maybe catch wind of what they're going to do. So I actually like the way that's kind of structured in there. And then chapter 2, we've basically met in Allegan. There's of course, a classic, just pompous asshole athlete named, what's his name? Yalbalar, who's the high elf. We do get some really cute original artwork here. These kind of black and white drawings, which are fantastic and actually really add a lot to the whole storytelling aspect. So I thought that was a pretty cool thing. More flow charts here. And we get a practice match originally, which is important because we need to learn how to play the game. Once we've completed kind of a social check to even, compete and of course have a big wager scene, which is very fun. We do get a chance to explore the resort a little bit, but not until after the practice match. But I was a bit disappointed because the rules. All right, so the game, we need to go over the game. The game is, you've got 2 teams, and there's a bunch of targets, as if you can see. This is, by the way, not a Target branded thing, but I would caution anybody for using a very famous corporate logo as your main like page branding here. I also don't think it looks particularly good. It's kind of distracting. But it does have something to do with the game. The game is a bunch of targets that appear in an arena, and you have like your targets and the enemy targets, and your goal is to protect your targets while you take out the enemy targets. You can have some players on offense, so they have a bow and arrow, and other players on defense, which means they have a shield. And your goal is to protect your targets while at the same time trying to eliminate the other party's targets. And at the end of every round, you're supposed to put everybody in calm initiative, which is usually where you're going to do a sports match. Some of the targets can shift and teleport into other spaces. If I can find the map, there we go. So you can see on this map, there's little circles indicating kind of all the potential places where the targets could end up. Now that's all fine and so far pretty original. We don't have any kind of like real world sport analogs that I can think of for this. The rules beyond that though are a little bit underdeveloped. I appreciate the fact that on offense, you have to hit an opposing target using your bow and arrow. So we can infer, okay, we'll just regular ranged attack then. It's an AC 12 to hit the outer rings and AC 17 to hit the target center. So you're making an attack roll. And then basically depending on how well you roll the attack, you can either hit an outer ring or an inner ring. And I like the fact that no matter what you hit, the target is considered shot and thus it disappears. However, you get more points if you can get that 17 or higher and hit the target center. You get 9 points versus 3 points if you only hit the outer ring. So there's actually a score at the end. It's not just the first necessarily to shoot all the targets. It might be the person who can shoot the targets the best. So that's for offense. On defense, you can do 2 things. You've only got a shield, and you can either choose to block a target, which just gives it +1 AC, which is not that impressive and also kind of sucks to have like a player character do their entire turn to just add +1 AC so somebody else is making the roll. That's kind of lame. The other thing you can do is knock people down. You can body check them, which now I'm thinking, okay, that's a lot more interesting. And you can imagine everybody with a shield is going to be wanting to do that, run around and knock people down. The problem is I couldn't figure out what the rules for this was and not even what that does. So literally it says to check their opponent below the neck, knocking them to the ground. A checked player cannot be checked again the very next round. Okay, that's a good rule. Give them time to get back on their feet. Beyond shield checks, any other form of roughness will be penalized. The only legal attack and is an improvised check with the provided regulation shield. So it doesn't say, like, first of all, how do you do that? Is that an attack roll or is that a strength, athletics, contested check? And also, it doesn't say what that does. It just says knocks them to the ground. Like, okay, does that knock them prone? In which case, 5e rules for being prone, you just spend half your movement to stand up. So I guess technically it just slows them down if the targets teleport around, but if the target, and it's only a chance for a target teleport around, so it may not also matter that much. So I guess I'm just not seeing defense as being as compelling or interesting as offense, but I do appreciate that there's a chance to do something other than if people like sucking a bow and arrow, for example. Also, interestingly, magic is allowed. This is an elven sport after all. But there are rules and regulations about that. You can't harm other people, and what is it? You can't. It has to be non-lethal, and defensive spells can last one combat round, which are good rules to have. And there's also fouls, various fouls for like going out of the arena or like knocking people around excessively or trying to, bodily harm anybody or something like that. And you can have fouls on you, which subtract your points. So it's got some good rules. I think it's a good start, but I immediately came up, just based on reading these rules, I came up with some questions and concerns about how certain things ruled, how to run certain things. And I, came up with a kind of a little sports mini game for our last campaign, Rime of the Frost Maiden, for an ancient game called Chain Lightning, which occurred during, I guess it's too much spoilers to talk about Rime of the Frost Maiden, the late game, basically, I will say. And it was the same. I ran into a similar situation where I was trying to come up with some rules, and it gets pretty hard, honestly, to try to create a sport for D&D that has every player feel like they can contribute, because players have a lot of different skill sets, and that can be a tricky way to do it. And I think my players figured out a way they can do it. And I, could quickly adapt rules on the fly, but it's one of those things where you really need to come up with rules and then beta test it and then see how well that works with a group and then kind of go from there. But even without beta testing this, I can look and say, well, what are the rules for like body checking people like that? So there were already some underdeveloped stuff here. And that's important because this whole thing is centered on this sport. And I think it's a cool start to a sport. I just think there should have been a little bit more depth to it and a little bit better of a mechanical breakdown. I'm also disappointed that when we get to the practice, it's basically just montaged, and I feel like, well, okay, this is a practice, and we need to get to the big, the big night is always the big climax of every sport movie, is the big, sporting match, and so the practice isn't that necessarily, and yet it talks about this practice like you're kind of montaging through the events of the Pixies coming out and messing with people, and I didn't like this being a montage, because I think that's something you have to be very careful of as a DM, and the players, if they're out there and then there's important things happening, they want to be involved in those things. Instead, it just says, in fact, I'll just read you this kind of portion. After Tasman, which is your allied dwarf, walks the party through the basics of Allegan, Yelbalar, who's the head jerk athlete, and his team of legends takes the court to show off. The legends are spectacular. They race through the court, leap out of the way of shields, and make shots with their eyes closed. They put on an impressive, intimidating display. So we're not letting the dice tell the story then, right? Because you're just telling me the story. And the designer runs into this a few times, by the way. There is no read aloud text, for example, that, like, a lot of you'll read 5e adventures and they'll have, like, the sidebars at the top, which are meant to be the DM reads this aloud to the players. Instead, the designer kind of bakes all of this into all these paragraphs, which makes it read more like a novel or prose than a like a design document for the DM. So I found running into that quite a few times. So there'll be like dialogue just in the middle of, this is all, like, look at these are paragraphs and paragraphs of information. And granted, they do a good job of inserting some art in here, but it still gets a little, it's a little jarring for me. I haven't actually run into that situation in a long time where as well as the designer did a good job of organizing like the subheadings and the flowcharts, I feel like they kind of lost the plot when it came to inserting too much like prose and narrative into also like important design things I need to know, and those probably should be separated a little bit better. And yeah, this montage thing kind of annoys me because then it goes with this other montage of how the Pixies are taking over the court. They start tripping over their bootlaces. The bowstring suddenly snap. Targets jerk to the right unexpectedly. So again, am I the DM supposed to be doing that? Like, are we still telling the story with the dice and going through the motions? All of a sudden, I have Pixies showing up doing these things. And how do I do that? Like, that's really skipping a lot of important stuff for me, the DM, to know to be able to run this. And it just seems like I'm telling a story versus running a game from that point of view. Maybe I'm just getting the wrong vibe from it, but that's kind of how I felt about it. Then we get to a good section of the game, which is the practice has ended. The Pixies have showed up. The athlete has stormed off, saying, "Oh, we need to get rid of these Pixies." And then the players are given a chance to basically do different things before the night before the big match. And I actually appreciated there's a lot of options for them to do. It's not at all linear here, and there's a little bit where the designer says, well, everything takes some amount of time, and time will elapse so much. I would probably even do it simpler than that. Just say, here's like 5 or 6 things you could do, and whether or not you, the DM, want to actually tell the players that or just give them the reins and let them walk around and choose things. But I would probably try to either tell them or nudge them towards the fact they could only do some of these things. They're not meant to be able to do all of these things, I think, is what the designer was saying, and also get the benefits of a full rest without being exhausted by the next day. So the things include you can crash the party that the big, fun jocks are at, which of course would happen during the movie if this were a movie. You can try to just steal the treasure that's here at the resort. You can stumble upon a pair of saboteurs working on the equipment that the players will use for the match, which is a big thing, a big story consequence there if they find them or not. They can just choose to eat a really fine meal, which could end up giving them some buffs. They could end up kind of chumming it up with the athlete's wife and get some good insight to kind of insult him for the next game. There's a scene between the groundskeeper and the Pixies that you can kind of interrupt, and you can choose to either back up the Pixies or even try to kill them or whatever you want to try to do. That also has consequences. So there's fun things to do, but I appreciate the fact that they all have interesting consequences leading up to the big match, which feels just very impactful, meaningful, and you really get like caught up in the story, I guess. So I appreciated all of this. Most of this shouldn't even involve combat, although it does say weirdly that like you can technically fight the one groundskeeper, but like assuming you're a party of adventurers, even at level 1, he's a groundskeeper. Like I think he would like back down immediately. Like I can't see that being an actual fight. And then the Pixies don't seem like they actually want to fight either. They're just wanting to be, picking on people and bullying them, but not in technically sort of justified way. And then we get the night of the big match, which actually breaks down, how the game works. Although we just kind of did that during the practice run, but just kind of gives an overall strategy. But again, the strategy kind of, I was more annoyed with like, well, okay, we don't have rules for this, we don't have rules for that, and really just played a little too fast and loose with how the game is supposed to interact. But I appreciate that the Pixies showing up and how they interact depends entirely on how the players previously dealt with the Pixies, which feels, again, very impactful and consequential. And there's a bunch of pranks they could either do on the opposing team or on the player team or both. And then the outcome could be either an awesome victory, and Tasman, of course, wins her dream of being let into this league, or she loses, and that could still mean she gets into the league, depending on the other things the players have done, or maybe social checks they've made, grudgingly let her in. Or it could be that she just loses. But the nice thing is her character is written to where she's just such an upbeat, positive person that even losing, she would still be like, all right, well, that was really fun, and I'm going to start my own league. Like, it's just a really fun NPC. It's almost jarring in a world of, people with like traumas and just edgelord attitudes and stuff. I appreciated Tasman quite a bit. And then of course you can resolve the whole Pixie subplot. And for a lot of adventures, the lack of a good epilogue or detailed ending notes is often a complaint of mine. This one, it is the opposite. It is something I will praise. There's a full 2 pages here of different epilogues and outcomes and things, which are very important. And I appreciate a good ending to the story. And then the final thing is we get a bunch of stat blocks for all of the excuse me, all the different players that are on the enemy team, which can scale depending on how many players you've got on your team. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for Target Run. Pro, Alagon is an interesting original sport, although I have complaints about it, which we'll get to in the cons section. I appreciate the fact that it is something new. It does feature its own arena, although the arena is not asymmetrical, which drives me fucking crazy because if there's one thing all sports have in common, it is an asymmetrical arena. Or not, sorry, I said that wrong. This is an asymmetrical arena. What all sports have in common is a symmetrical arena. They are even on both sides. Everything should be the same. That's the whole point of fairness. And this one clearly is not quite like angled or set up the exact same. That bothered me more probably than it should. But I like the fact that it's got these teleporting, targets, and people can be on offense or defense. It seems like there's a lot of a good idea and starts of an interesting sport that you have to learn about and would require like select skills and actual teammates working together and all that fun stuff. So mostly thumbs up on that. Pro, the Pixie subplot is nicely woven into the main story. I appreciate that it's not, even though it's like a 20-page adventure, it still has a pretty compelling subplot, which is the whole Pixie thing. And that actually ends up being an important part of the main plot because they, of course, come in during the practice match and then come in again during the final match, and how they end up interacting and what their final outcome is. There's a fun bit where even if you lose everything, maybe you've done so with the Pixies where they show up and just go through this whole revolution and just tear shit up and prank everybody, and they finally the athletes have to like throw in their hands and give them whatever it is they're owed in their home and stuff. So I thought that was a really nice part of the story. Pro, several fun activities for the party to choose the night before the match. That whole chapter 2 section that leads before the big match, kind of after the practice prank montage I'm not too much of a fan of, is really good stuff. All of these different areas feel compelling and interesting. I think it would be awesome if the party actually split up and was able to do as many of these as possible, and that thus some of them could get certain bonuses more than others, or find out more information, or again stop the saboteurs. And doing all this actually is really good stuff, and I appreciated there was a lot to do in this resort. Not when you first get there, but the night of, leading before the big match. And then Pro, multiple outcomes and epilogues. Thank you for including plenty of notes about the conclusion. That's something that too many adventures gloss over, and that is not glossed over here, which I appreciate. So my cons are that some of the sports rules are underdeveloped. I had a lot of questions coming out of the sports rules about how certain things worked. And like magic is almost too vague because there's a lot of magic abilities players could use. The fact that players could be anywhere from level 1 to 4 bothered me. Like there needed to be kind of a set, tier probably for this, because that could still be a big deal. And I mean, I assume the stat blocks, what are the stat blocks? Yeah, are CR2s and 3s. So they're going to be, a lot tougher for like a level 1 party than a level 3 or 4 party. But the sport has a really good start to it. I just think it needed a little more time and probably some beta testing to see if it really worked out in the field. And speaking of field, probably needs a symmetrical field. My other con is that it doesn't have any read aloud sidebars. I think that was the best way I could kind of explain my complaints about how it's organized, because the whole thing, I don't have a problem with how the whole thing is organized. It's got the subheadings, it's got the chapters, it's got even adventure flowcharts. All of that is fine. It's just when you get to the actual parts in here, I think they're just written too much like a story and less like a design document for a DM. So it's fun for me to read through it from a story perspective, but then as I'm trying to come up with, what I'm supposed to say to the party and what the dialogue is, it just gets needlessly tricky for me to have to come up with all that information, I guess. So that was kind of it's a weird complaint to have. I don't usually see that happen to a lot of adventures, but that did happen here. Final verdict. While not flawless, Target Run successfully captures the fun and spirit of a sports comedy story within an original D&D adventure. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on the channel, and you can support my work at patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Thomas, Stan, Brandon, Genocider, David, Eclectic Roleplay Roll, Christopher, Brian, Corey, Koa 1337, Big Nut, John F, John L, Scott, Eric, Tyler, Nathan, Camp Crystal Lake Counselor, Andrew C, Daryl the Relderin, Captain Woody 79, Jaren Argius, Stephanie, Andrew H, B01135809, and Patrick. And gold patrons: RPG Paper Crafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Lippy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, Scott, Rufus, Karen, William, Jerry, Thomas, and Prophet. Thank you all very much for your support.